Dorothea Vane, spent her last $7 on a broken loom that 3 men had already walked away from. And everyone in Millhaven watched her load it onto her wagon, with the particular silence of people who had already decided how the story ended. It was October, the kind that comes in sharp off the river flats and reminds you winter doesn't negotiate. Dorothea was 29 years old, recently widowed, and standing in the mud outside Callum Briggs's feedlot, where the loom had sat unclaimed since June. The thing was a wreck. One of the heddle frames had cracked through. The reed was bent at an angle that made no mechanical sense. 2 of the treadles were missing entirely, replaced at some point with rope and prayer by whoever had owned it before the Briggs family had taken it in trade for a debt. 3 men had come to look at it since summer. 3 men had walked away. Dorothea did not walk away. Her brother-in-law, Owen, who had driven the wagon out with her because she'd asked him to, and he was not the kind of man who refused requests from women in difficult circumstances, stood with his arms folded and watched her examine the loom with an expression that sat somewhere between concern and the very beginnings of resignation. "Dot," he said. "I see it," she said. "You see the heddle frame. I see all of it." He looked at the loom. He looked at her. He was a practical man, Owen Vane, broad-shouldered and deliberate, with the kind of face that showed its thinking if you knew how to read it. What his face said now was that he was adding up numbers, and the numbers were not coming out in favor of this particular decision. $7 is what we have, he said. Until spring. I know what we have. And you want to spend it on a loom that 3 people already decided wasn't worth spending money on. Dorothea straightened up. She looked at the loom the way she had been looking at it for 10 minutes, which was not the way a person looks at a piece of junk. It was the way a person looks at a problem they have already decided is solvable and are now working out the shape of the solution. Those 3 people were looking at what it is, she said. I'm looking at what it does. Owen didn't say anything to that. He stood with his arms still folded and watched her count out $7 from the envelope she kept in her coat pocket and hand it to Callum Briggs, who took the money with the expression of a man who couldn't quite believe his luck. They loaded the loom together. It was heavy, awkward, and disagreeable about the process, the way broken things often are. By the time they had it secured in the wagon bed, Dorothea's hands were raw from the cold and the rope, and she had a splinter in her left palm that she didn't stop to deal with until they were halfway home. Owen drove. He was quiet for a long time, which was his way. "What's your plan?" he said finally, and that was Owen. Not why did you do this, not what were you thinking, but what's your plan? As if the plan was already assumed. Dorothea told him while they drove. The river flats opening up on their left in the gray October light. The bare cottonwoods along the bank, standing like something waiting for permission to move. She had been thinking about the loom for 3 weeks, since she'd first heard Briggs mention it in passing at the dry goods store. She had not mentioned this to Owen or to anyone else. She had simply filed it somewhere in the back of her mind, alongside everything else she had been filing there since August, when her husband Thomas had died of a fever that came on fast and didn't give any of them a chance to properly argue with it. Thomas had left her the house, the half-acre kitchen garden, and a situation that looked, from the outside, like not very much. No children, no family of her own within 2 states. A brother-in-law who helped when he could and was generous about it, but had his own household and his own winter to manage. A town that had been kind since the funeral in the way that towns are kind. Briefly, sincerely, and then with the gradual drift back toward their own concerns. Dorothea was not resentful of any of this. It was the nature of things, what she was clear-eyed about it in a way that Thomas's death had accelerated if not exactly created. She had always been the one who looked at situations directly. Thomas had loved her for it and occasionally found it unnerving, which she had always thought was a fair response. The loom was not sentimentality. It was not desperation. It was an observation. Millhaven had 3 households that were buying woven goods from the supplier in Granger, 30 miles east, at prices that reflected the distance. She had seen the invoices in the dry goods store, where Harmon Park kept them pinned near the counter in an order that suggested he was proud of his accounting if not his negotiating. The prices were not reasonable. They were the prices of people who had no local alternative. A functioning loom in Millhaven was not a vanity project. It was a gap that existed and had a number attached to it. The problem was the loom was not functioning. "The heddle frame I can fix," she told Owen, watching the road. I've done it before. My grandmother had a loom. I spent 3 summers learning it. You haven't touched one in 10 years. I haven't needed to. She looked at her hands on her lap. The reed needs replacing. That's money, but not much. The treadles I can rebuild from the oak boards in the barn. The real problem is the tension mechanism on the warp beam. Something's bent or broken in there. I won't know which until I can take it apart and look at it clearly. Owen was quiet again. And if you can't fix the tension mechanism, then I'll know that, Dorothea said, and I'll figure out what comes next. He made a sound that was not quite a sigh. Thomas always said you were the most stubborn person he'd ever known. Thomas said it like it was a compliment. It was, Owen said. He meant it as one. The loom went into the front room of the house, which was the only room large enough to hold it and still allow for movement around it. This reorganized the furniture significantly and made the front room look, for the next several days, like the aftermath of something rather than a place where people lived. Dorothea did not apologize for this to anyone, because the only person who came to the house regularly was Owen, and Owen did not require apologies about furniture arrangement. She started the disassembly on the second day, methodical, piece by piece, laying each component on the long table she'd moved against the wall for the purpose, and marking each one with a strip of cloth so she would know where it came from and what it connected to. She was not rushing. Rushing was how you broke things that were already broken in ways you hadn't found yet. The heddle frame was exactly what it looked like from the outside. A clean break through the wood, old enough that the edges had dried out and would need to be cut fresh before any repair would hold. That was a manageable problem. Her grandmother's loom had cracked the same way in a dry summer, and the repair her grandmother had made had lasted another 12 years. The reed was beyond salvaging. She set it aside and added it to the list she was keeping in a small notebook she'd bought from Harmon Park store the week before. The notebook had begun as a shopping list. It was becoming something more detailed than that. The treadles were straightforward. She had the oak boards. She had the tools. She had done enough carpentry work around the house since August that the work of it felt familiar in her hands in a way she was grateful for. The tension mechanism was the problem she had expected it to be. When she finally reached it, after 2 days of careful disassembly, she found not a break but a warp, a slow bend in the iron rod that controlled the warp beam's resistance. Something had been loaded onto the loom wrong at some point, or someone had adjusted it without understanding what they were adjusting, and the rod had bent under uneven stress over time until the whole mechanism was working against itself. She looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote in the notebook, "Tension rod, warped. Need to determine if straightenable or replacement required. Ask Doyle about iron work." Calvin Doyle ran the smithy at the edge of Millhaven's main road. He was a spare, quiet man in his 50s, who had opinions about iron that most people did not fully understand, but all people respected. He had shod horses for Dorothea and Thomas for 6 years, and had never charged them more than was fair. She brought the tension rod to him on a Thursday morning, wrapped in cloth, and set it on his workbench and explained what it had come from and what it needed to do. Doyle examined it without speaking for a while. He turned it in his hands. He held it up to the light from the smithy door with the focus of someone who had spent decades reading metal. "It's not broken. It's tired. Can you straighten it?" He set it down. "I can. Whether it holds after is a different question. Iron remembers stress. You straighten it. You're asking it to forget something it's been doing for years. What are the odds it holds?" He considered. "Fair. Better than even." "I've done it with worse. What do you charge?" He named a price. It was less than she'd expected, which she kept off her face. "When can you have it done?" "End of next week. I've got 3 horses ahead of you." "That's fine." She picked up the cloth. "I'll leave it with you." He took it. He looked at her with the direct, unadorned attention of a man who evaluated things on their evident nature. "Briggs's loom," he said. It wasn't a question. Word traveled in Millhaven the way it did in all small places. Fast and thorough. "Yes." 3 men looked at that thing and walked. "I know. What do you see in it that they didn't?" Dorothea thought about how to answer that honestly. "They saw what it was," she said. "I saw what it could be made to do." Doyle nodded once. He didn't say whether he thought that was wise or foolish. He was not the kind of man who offered opinions on other people's decisions. He simply turned back to his work, and Dorothea walked back out into the October morning. The weeks that followed were what she had expected, and also harder than she had expected, which was a distinction she was familiar with. Expecting difficulty and living it were always different things, regardless of how well you'd prepared for the gap between them. She repaired the heddle frame with the technique her grandmother had shown her: fresh-cut edges, proper joinery, a third piece added behind the brake to distribute the tension so the original joint wasn't carrying the full load alone. It held. She tested it carefully before she trusted it. She built the treadles from the oak boards. That part went cleanly. Treadles were not complicated. They were a mechanical sequence that either worked or didn't, and these worked. She ordered the replacement reed from a supplier in Granger through Harmon Park's catalog. It arrived in 11 days, which was faster than she'd been told to expect. She paid for it from the small amount remaining after Doyle's fee and the other materials, which left her in a situation she did not think about directly, because thinking about it directly was not useful. What was useful was that the reed arrived, and it was the right size, and she could move forward. Doyle delivered the tension rod on a Saturday afternoon, driving it out himself, rather than waiting for her to come collect it. He set it on her workbench in the front room, looked at the reassembly work she'd done, made no comment, and left. She thought about that later. The absence of comment from a man like Doyle was itself a comment. She fitted the rod back into the mechanism that evening, working by lamplight because the light inside the house was not adequate to the task, and she did not want to wait until morning. She fitted it and adjusted it and tested the resistance on the warp beam 12 times before she was satisfied. Then she sat back on the stool she'd pulled up next to the loom and looked at the whole thing assembled. It had been 4 weeks since she'd brought it home. She had not yet threaded it. She was not ready to thread it. Threading was the commitment, the moment where all the repair work either justified itself or didn't, and she wanted to be certain before she made it. She went through the mechanism again the next morning and the morning after. She worked the treadles. She tested the heddle frames. She checked the tension at 6 points along the warp beam. She took notes in the notebook, which had expanded well beyond its original purpose and was now running close to full. On the 4th morning, she threaded the loom. She used the wool she'd been keeping in the cedar chest in the bedroom. Thomas's mother's wool, brought west in a trunk and never used, still clean, still good, a dark red that had not faded in the dry air of the chest. She set up the warp slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her, taking more time than was technically necessary because she was not in a hurry and because the care at the start of a warp showed in the cloth at the end of it. She wove the first test length that afternoon. It was not her best work. She had not woven in 11 years, and her hands knew the sequence without remembering the particular feel of it, which meant the first several inches were uneven in ways she could see if she looked closely. But the loom moved. The shed opened cleanly. The tension held across the full width of the warp. The treadles responded the way they were supposed to respond. She ran her hand across the test length and felt the weave under her fingers and thought, "This works." Owen came by that evening, as he sometimes did, ostensibly to check the firewood supply. He stood in the doorway of the front room and looked at the loom, threaded and warped, and with the test length on it for a long moment without speaking. "It works," he said. "It works," she said. He came in and looked more closely. He touched the heddle frame repair the way a carpenter touches joinery, reading it with his fingers. "You cut fresh edges on the brake, my grandmother's method." He stepped back. "What now? Now I practice until my hands remember how to do it right. Then I start producing something worth selling." He looked at her. He had the expression that had become familiar to her over these weeks, the one where he was recalibrating something. "How long to practice?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, and selling. There are 3 households in Millhaven buying woven goods from Granger. I've seen the prices. I can do better. She turned back to the loom. Harmon Park buys in quantity. He'd rather source locally if the quality is right. I know that because he told Thomas 2 years ago. When Thomas was thinking about the tanning shed, Thomas didn't do the tanning shed. Thomas had other things to spend the money on. I don't. Owen was quiet. Then, "Have you talked to Harmon?" "Not yet. I'll talk to him when I have something to show him." She practiced. 2 weeks, then into a third, because she had been honest when she'd said 2. But honesty didn't always line up with the pace at which hands recovered their memory. She wove lengths of wool, cut them, examined them, noted in the notebook where the evenness came in and where it still slipped. She adjusted the tension twice based on what she observed. She experimented with the rhythm of the treadles, the angle at which she threw the shuttle, the amount of pressure she was applying at the beater. It was not complicated in the way that complicated things are complicated. It was complicated in the way that any skill is complicated when you are trying to understand it rather than simply do it. Understanding meant being able to say why something worked, which meant being able to reproduce it deliberately rather than accidentally. She wrote all of it in the notebook. By the end of the third week, she had 4 lengths of cloth that satisfied her. Not because they were perfect, which they were not, but because they were consistent, and consistency was what could be explained and repeated and built upon. She brought a sample to Harmon Park on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, folded and wrapped in brown paper. Harmon was behind his counter, where he was always behind his counter, going through his ledger with the absorbed focus of a man whose real relationship in life was with his accounts. He looked up when she came in and then looked at the package. Mrs. Vane. Harmon. She set the package on the counter and unfolded it. He looked at the cloth. He picked it up and held it, which was how he assessed everything, with his hands, running his thumbs across the weave in 2 directions. This is from Briggs's loom, he said. It's from my loom, she said, which I purchased from Briggs. He set the cloth down. 3 men looked at that loom and walked away. I've heard that. What did you do to it? She told him. She kept it brief, not because the detail wasn't relevant, but because Harmon Park's attention was a resource she didn't want to spend on anything other than the question he would eventually ask. He listened without interrupting. He picked the cloth up again and turned it over. What are you asking per yard? He said. She had worked out the number carefully. Not what she needed, which was a figure arrived at from desperation, but what the work was worth, which was a figure arrived at from the Granger invoices she had looked at twice. She told him. It was 15% below what he was paying for the Granger supply, accounting for the transport he was currently paying. Harmon set the cloth down and was quiet. He was a man who did his thinking visibly but silently, which she had always appreciated. He was not performing consideration. He was actually considering. I want 2 more samples, he said. Different weights if you can. I need to see if the quality holds. Give me 3 weeks. I'll need them by the 1st of December to make sense for the winter season. You'll have them before that. She left the counter and walked home along the main road, and the November cold was the same November cold it had been an hour ago, and nothing had changed yet, but something had shifted in the quality of what the next few months might look like, and she registered that shift without making too much of it. It was not a victory. It was a conversation that had gone in the right direction. Those were different things. The samples she brought Harmon on the 24th of November were better than the first. She knew it before she handed them over. She had learned things in the 3 weeks between them, small refinements in the tension and the beat that showed up in the hand of the cloth if you knew how to feel for it. Harmon knew how to feel for it. He looked at all 3 lengths together for a long time. This one, he said, picking up the lightest weight. What's the thread count? She told him. He nodded. This is what I want for curtain fabric. Women in this county are buying curtain fabric from catalogs at prices I can't compete with because the transport kills me. But this. He held the cloth up toward the window. The winter light came through it evenly. This I can price right and still make margin. She watched him. And the heavier weight? Floor and table use. Yes. He set the lengths down and looked at her directly. I want a standing arrangement. Weekly supply as much as you can produce. I'll take everything you can make at the price you named for the first order. For volume, I'll come up another 8%. She kept her expression still. 8% was not what she'd hoped for. It was more than she'd hoped for. Standing arrangement, she said. Minimum order guaranteed each week in writing. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being asked to put things in writing by women in his store, but who was also, underneath that expression, a fair person. In writing, he said. Yes, fine. They shook on it across the counter. She walked home in the November cold with the samples under her arm, and she thought about Thomas's mother's wool in the cedar chest, how much of it there was, whether it would last the winter or whether she would need to source more before spring and from where. Practical things, the kind of thinking that was its own form of certainty. Word moved through Millhaven the way it always did. By the time Harmon Park had told his wife about the arrangement, and his wife had told the woman next door, and the woman next door had told her daughter, who told anyone who would listen, the story had already simplified itself into the form that stories take when they travel. The widow who bought the broken loom for $7 and talked Harmon Park into a supply contract. Dorothea became aware of her new standing in the community gradually, the way you become aware of a change in weather. Not in one moment, but in an accumulation of small signals that eventually added up to something you couldn't ignore. The quality of greetings on the main road. The way conversations in the dry goods store shifted slightly when she walked in. The number of women who found reasons to stop at her gate. Most of them were curious. Some of them were skeptical in the specific way of people who have decided someone's success is probably simpler than it appears. A few were genuinely interested in the loom itself, in the process, in the question of whether what she was doing could be done differently or could be taught. Miriam Calloway was not most of them. Miriam was 44 years old, a farmer's wife from the north end of the county who had the broad, unhurried manner of someone who had been working outdoors her whole life and had made a private accommodation with difficulty so complete that difficulty no longer particularly surprised her. She arrived at Dorothea's gate on a Thursday in early December without warning, which was her way, tying her horse to the post with the efficiency of someone who had tied horses to many posts and had no patience for elaborating the gesture. "Mrs. Vane," she said, "I've heard you're weaving now." "I am." Miriam looked at the house. "May I see it?" Dorothea let her in. Miriam stood in the front room and looked at the loom the way people looked at things they were genuinely trying to understand rather than merely observe. She walked around it. She crouched and looked at the treadle mechanism. She put her hand on the warp beam and felt the tension. "This was Briggs's wreck," she said. "It was? You fixed the tension rod." Dorothea looked at her. "How did you know that was the problem?" "My father had a loom with the same fault. We couldn't fix ours. The rod had cracked through, not bent. We ended up burning it for firewood the winter my mother died." She stood up. "I always thought if we'd caught it earlier." She stopped. She looked at the cloth on the loom, the current length halfway through. "What are you producing for Park?" Dorothea told her. The curtain weight, the table weight, the approximate weekly volume. Miriam listened. She was the kind of listener who made you feel that what you were saying was being actually heard rather than waded through. "My sister in Granger has been asking me for 2 years if I know a local source for decent wool cloth," Miriam said. "Her husband runs a boarding house. They go through table and floor linen like weather goes through firewood. She's been paying Granger prices, which means she's been paying for the whole supply chain every time." Dorothea looked at her. "Is she someone you could put me in contact with?" "I could do that, yes." Miriam was quiet for a moment. She looked at the notebook sitting open on the side table, the pages dense with Dorothea's careful handwriting. "What is that?" "Records. I keep notes on every adjustment I make. What I changed, why, what the result was." Miriam picked it up, with a look that asked permission first and received a nod. She read a page, then another. Her expression did not change in any obvious way, but something in her attention sharpened. "You documented the tension rod repair," she said. "And what happened to the cloth quality after? I document everything. If it works, I want to know exactly what worked. If it fails, I want to know what I tried so I can try something different." Miriam set the notebook down. She looked at Dorothea with the direct, considering look of someone updating an opinion. "There are 4 women in this county I know of who have looms sitting idle," she said. 3 of them because they don't know how to fix what's wrong. 1 because she never learned to warp properly and can't find anyone to show her. Dorothea looked at her. "Are you asking me something?" "Not yet," Miriam said. "I'm telling you what I know. You can decide what to do with it." She left soon after, the same way she'd arrived, direct, without fuss, the sound of her horse diminishing down the road toward the north. Dorothea stood in the front room and looked at the loom and at the notebook beside it and thought about 4 idle looms and what that represented in practical terms. Not just the women who owned them, but what those looms could produce if they were working, and what working looms in this county would mean for the network of people who needed what they produced. She wrote in the notebook, "M. Calloway, 4 idle looms in county, 3 repair unknown, 1 warping instruction needed, first outside inquiry beyond commerce." She underlined the last sentence. She thought about it for the rest of the evening. December came in the way. December came to the river flats, with a cold that had been building for weeks, and finally stopped, pretending it was anything other than what it was. The house was warm enough. The loom ran 6 hours a day most days, more when the light was good, and she had slept enough to sustain the concentration that good weaving required. The arrangement with Harmon Park was producing what she'd calculated it would produce. The first weekly delivery had gone without complication. The second delivery, she had brought a third weight she hadn't originally discussed. A fine, close-woven length she'd been working out in the evenings, experimenting with the shuttle speed and beat pressure, and set it on the counter without comment and let him pick it up. He had picked it up and looked at it, and been quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was doing arithmetic. "What's this for?" he'd said. "I don't know yet," Dorothea said. "I made it to see if I could. What do you see in it?" He'd held it up toward the window again, his standard method. Collar and cuff work. Women's wear if the weight's consistent across lengths. He set it down. "Is it consistent?" "Yes. Prove it to me with 3 lengths, and I'll add it to the order." She'd proved it. Owen came to the house on a Sunday in mid-December, which was his usual pattern, checking in without making the checking in feel like inspection. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee she made, and looked at the loom through the open door of the front room with the expression she had come to read as his version of having something to say. "Half the women in Millhaven are talking about you," he said. "I know. Harmon Park told Reverend Settle that you were the best business decision he'd made since he expanded the dry goods shelf in '84. She looked at him. "Harmon Park said that out loud, apparently. He didn't say it to me." "No," Owen said. "He said it to Reverend Settle, which means he said it to everyone." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Thomas would have been." He stopped. He looked at the cup. "He'd have been very pleased, Dot. I know he would." She looked at her hands. "I know." A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the December wind worked at the eaves with its usual persistence. "The Calloway woman came back," Owen said. "She came back twice," Dorothea said. "Once to bring me her sister's information in Granger. Once with a woman named Pearl Dunn, who has a loom she can't figure out how to thread." Owen looked up. And I showed Pearl Dunn how to thread her loom." She looked at the front room. "It took most of an afternoon. She's a quick learner. She already understood the mechanical principle. She just needed someone to show her where to start. Are you going to start doing that?" "Teaching?" Dorothea thought about it carefully, the way she thought about anything that was going to commit her to something. "I'm going to think about what that means before I say yes or no," she said. "Teaching one person in an afternoon is one thing. Building something around it is another, and you'd want to build something." She looked at him. "Wouldn't you?" He made the sound that was his version of a concession. "What does it look like? What you'd build?" She thought about the 4 idle looms Miriam had mentioned. She thought about Harmon Park's accounting and what volume she could produce alone versus what volume was theoretically possible if the other looms in the county were running. She thought about the boarding house in Granger and the supply line that was currently running 30 miles in the wrong direction. "More looms working," she said. "Women who know how to repair them and run them. A market that understands what local goods are worth because someone's taken the time to demonstrate it." Owen was quiet. He had the look of a man doing practical arithmetic. "That's not a small thing." "No, but it starts small." She turned back to the notebook on the table, which she'd been writing in when he arrived. Everything does. The complication arrived the way complications tend to arrive, through a person she hadn't been watching. Frances Albee was the wife of the county's largest dry goods importer, a man named Hector Albee, who did business out of an office in Granger, and had for 6 years been the primary source for most of what Harmon Park stocked in the way of fabric and woven goods. Frances was in Millhaven twice a month, visiting her sister, and she was at the dry goods store the 3rd time Dorothea made a delivery. She was not unfriendly. That was the first thing Dorothea noticed. She was a composed woman in her 40s, with the particular poise of someone who has always had enough money that money itself is not a thing she thinks about much. She watched Dorothea set the cloth on the counter. She watched Harmon pick it up and examine it with the attention he brought to Dorothea's deliveries that was visibly different from the attention he brought to catalog goods. "That's local weaving," Frances said. "It is," Harmon said. I heard there was a woman here who'd repaired the Briggs loom. She looked at Dorothea directly. You're Mrs. Vane. I am. My husband's been wondering about you. She said it with a pleasantness that was entirely opaque. He heard about the park arrangement. He has an interest in understanding what's produced locally and what that means for the supply structure he's built. Dorothea kept her expression level. Your husband is welcome to come look at the work. He may do that. Frances picked up the edge of the closest length of cloth. She was not rough with it, but there was a possessive quality to the gesture that Dorothea noted. He'd want to understand the capacity, how much you can produce, where your materials come from, whether the arrangement with Park is exclusive. The arrangement with Park covers what I currently produce, Dorothea said. Whether it's exclusive depends on what other arrangements might look like. Frances set the cloth down. She smiled, and the smile was perfectly adequate and communicated almost nothing. I'll tell him you're open to a conversation. She left, and Harmon watched her go through the store window with an expression that Dorothea couldn't fully read. Hector Albee, she said. He's not a bad man, Harmon said. He's a businessman. Those are sometimes different things, and sometimes not. She took that home with her and turned it over while she wove that afternoon, the shuttle moving in the familiar rhythm that had become, over these weeks, as natural as breathing. She understood what Hector Albee would want. He would want either to absorb what she was building into the supply structure he already controlled, or to understand it well enough to replicate it somewhere in his existing network. Both outcomes were technically possible. Neither of them was what she wanted. What she wanted was to remain the origin of the thing. That evening, she opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote down what she knew, what she needed to find out, and what she was not willing to give away. She wrote it the same way she'd written the tension rod repair, with precision, not from the position of what she feared, but from the position of what she actually knew to be true. She knew that the loom was hers. The notebook was hers. What was in her hands and in her eyes when she looked at cloth was hers in a way that could not be transferred in a single conversation. She knew that Harmon Park valued the arrangement not just because of the price, but because of the reliability and the quality, and the fact that when she said something was consistent, it was consistent. That relationship had a value she had not finished measuring. She knew that there were 4 women in the county with idle looms who represented potential that had nothing to do with Hector Albee's supply network. She wrote at the bottom of the page, "What I have is not a product. It is a method. You can buy a product. A method must be learned." She read it back and left it there. Hector Albee came himself, which she had not expected. She had expected a letter, or a representative, or a conversation through Frances. Instead, on a Thursday morning in late December, a hired buggy came up the road to her gate, and a heavy-set man in a good coat stepped out of it with the careful manner of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. He was not unkind. She had been told he was not a bad man, and she found, watching him come to her door, that this appeared to be true. He looked at the house and the yard with the evaluating attention of someone who was always, without quite deciding to, calculating worth. She put him at the kitchen table because the kitchen table was where things got decided. She did not make coffee. She wanted him to understand, without saying it, that this was a conversation she controlled the terms of. He seemed to understand this. He settled into the chair with a slight adjustment of his coat and looked at her across the table, with the directness of a man who found directness more efficient than preamble. "I'll tell you what I'm looking for without making you ask," he said. "Please," she said. He explained his business in the kind of clean, economical terms that told her he had made this speech before, and had refined it over time. He distributed fabric and woven goods through a network covering 4 counties. He had suppliers he'd worked with for years in established arrangements. What he did not have was a reliable local source in Millhaven County, because, until recently, there had been nothing worth sourcing. "What I'm interested in," he said, "is whether what you're producing is scalable, whether it can be expanded beyond 1 loom and 1 woman. Why does that matter to you? Because 1 loom and 1 woman is a specialty item. Interesting, but not significant at the volume I work with. 4 looms, 6 looms, 10 looms in a county, that's a supply structure." Dorothea looked at him steadily. "And you'd want to be the one who built that supply structure." He paused, just slightly. "I'd want to be part of it. That's a different answer from what you were going to say." He looked at her with an expression that moved through something and settled. "Yes," he said, "it is." She picked up the notebook from the table where she'd set it, and she opened it to the pages that covered the Miriam Calloway conversation, the idle looms, the repair documentation for 2 of those looms that Miriam had described to her in enough detail that she'd been able to work out the probable faults. She turned the notebook so he could read the page. He read it. He read the facing page. He looked up. "You've already started," he said. "I'm always already started," she said. "The question is what comes next." He sat back. He looked at the notebook with the expression she had seen on Harmon Park's face, when he'd understood what consistent quality actually meant in practical terms. It was the expression of a man who had just recalculated something. "What do you want?" he said. She told him. It was not a modest list, and she did not present it modestly, because what she had built and what she was capable of building were not modest things, and treating them as modest would have been a lie. She wanted support in accessing materials at the volume pricing his network could provide, raw wool, dye stuffs, the specific reed sizes that were difficult to source locally. She wanted his distribution network for anything produced beyond what the local market absorbed, which would grow as more looms came online. She wanted a formal arrangement that gave her clear control over what was taught and to whom, because the method was hers, and she would decide who learned it and how. In exchange, she said, you get access to a supply that right now doesn't exist. Clean, documented, consistent goods from a county you currently can't serve. And when the other looms are running, volume. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the notebook again. You keep records like this for every piece you produce? For every change I make to the process, every adjustment, every result. And you'd be willing to use that same approach to train other women. I'd be willing to share the framework, she said carefully. The framework is teachable. What I do with it is mine. He nodded slowly. He put his hands flat on the table, the way a man puts his hands flat when he's made a decision. They talked for another hour. He was a good negotiator, precise and unsentimental, which she respected. When she pushed back on his first offer for the materials access, he came back with a counter that was better than his first, and slightly less than she'd have liked, and they settled at a point that she could work with, and that acknowledged she had something he genuinely wanted. When he left, she stood at the gate and watched the hired buggy go back down the road toward Granger, and she thought about what had just happened and what it made possible, and how different the shape of the next year looked from the shape she had been looking at in October. Owen came by the next morning, because Owen always seemed to know when something had happened. Hector Albee came to see you, he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. He did, and, she told him. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, with the focused attention of someone whose response, when it came, would be based on what he'd actually heard. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Materials at volume pricing, he said. Distribution beyond the county. And I keep the teaching. I decide who learns the method and what that means. He looked at the notebook on the table. He'd been watching the notebook accumulate pages since October, and she thought he understood by now what it represented, though he'd never said so directly. What happens if one of the women you teach decides to go to Albee directly, he said. Take the knowledge you gave her and work outside your arrangement. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since Miriam Calloway's first visit. Then she does, Dorothea said. And more looms run, and more families have income, and the county has something it didn't have before. She paused. The practical answer is that what I know goes beyond what can be passed in an afternoon's lesson. I know why each adjustment works, not just what the adjustment is. That takes time to learn, and time learning it from me means a relationship that has its own value. Owen looked at her for a long moment. Then he made the sound that was his version of agreeing to something he hadn't expected to agree to. You're going to be busy, he said. I'm already busy, she said. I'm going to be more productively busy. He picked up his coffee. Thomas would have found you absolutely terrifying, he said, in the best possible way. She smiled at that. It came out before she could decide whether to let it. The weeks that followed were the most demanding of what had, since August, been an unrelentingly demanding year. The arrangement with Albee moved forward on the schedule they'd agreed to. The materials arrived at better prices than she'd been paying, and the difference showed up in her accounting in ways that allowed her to think about the second loom. not as a distant possibility, but as a practical question of timing. Miriam Calloway came back in January with Pearl Dunn and a third woman, Josephine Garrett, who had her mother's loom in pieces in a back shed and had not known what to do with it for 2 years. Dorothea looked at the pieces when they brought a drawing of them and told them what was likely salvageable and what was not, and was correct on all counts when they went and checked. She started teaching on a Tuesday because Tuesdays were when the morning light in the front room was best for the detail work. She taught the way she had come to understand teaching, which was not explaining what to do but explaining why, so that the person learning could see the logic of the loom rather than just the sequence of it. Pearl Dunn was quick, the way she'd been quick the first afternoon. She understood the tension relationships intuitively, which meant Dorothea could spend less time on those and more time on the things Pearl hadn't encountered yet. Josephine Garrett was slower, but more precise, which was a different kind of useful. She asked questions that made Dorothea have to think carefully about answers she had previously assumed she knew, and thinking carefully about answers she had previously assumed she knew turned out to be valuable. Miriam herself did not want to learn the loom. She had her own work. What she wanted was to understand the system that was building, the network of production and teaching and supply that Dorothea was assembling. She came and listened and asked the organizational questions and went back north with information that Dorothea trusted her to use well, because Miriam Calloway was a woman who used information well. Harmon Park doubled his standing order in February. He said it without ceremony, arriving at the counter on a Tuesday morning with a written amendment to their arrangement already prepared, which told her he'd been thinking about it for a while and had not been uncertain about the decision when he made it. She looked at the amendment and signed it. "You have more coming online," he said, meaning the other looms. "Pearl Dunn will be producing at quality by March," Dorothea said. "Josephine Garrett by April if the loom restoration goes as I expect." He nodded. "I'll want to inspect their work before I take it on the same terms." "Of course," she said. "That's the right way to do it." He looked at her with the expression that she had come to understand as his version of saying something he wasn't going to say directly. She waited. "What you've done here," he said finally, "I want you to know I see it. Not just the product. The whole thing." She accepted that. "Thank you, Harmon." "Wasn't charity," he said quickly, in case she'd mistaken it for something soft. "Exactly the opposite. You made it easy to do business with you. That's not as common as it should be." She smiled. He looked briefly startled by the smile, as if he'd said something funnier than he intended. She walked home in the February cold with the signed amendment in her coat pocket, and thought about what Harmon had said. Not the compliment, but the logic of it. She had made it easy to do business with her, not by lowering her prices or softening her requirements, but by being consistent, by being documented, by being the kind of reliable that came from having written down every adjustment she'd ever made and knowing exactly why each one worked. The notebook was the reason. She was certain of that. The notebook was not a record. It was the method itself made visible. That spring, on an afternoon in April when the cottonwoods along the river were just beginning to show color, Dorothea stood in the front room and looked at the loom that she had bought for $7 in October and thought about everything that had followed from that. 3 looms in the county were now producing at quality. A 4th was in repair. Harmon Park's standing order had grown by 200%. The Granger boarding house was a regular account. Hector Alby's quarterly bulletin for his supplier network had included, in the February issue, a paragraph about the Millhaven weaving operation that described it as a model of local production efficiency, with attribution to her name. Owen had read that paragraph aloud at the kitchen table, and then put the bulletin down and looked at her with the expression that meant he had a great deal to say and was going to say almost none of it. "Go ahead," she said. "Thomas," he said. "I'm just Thomas." "I know," she said. "I know." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the April morning was doing what April mornings did when they'd finally decided to commit to being spring. The light in the front room fell across the loom in a way that showed every detail of the warp, each thread in its place and under the right tension, and doing exactly what it was supposed to do. She thought about the October morning she'd stood in the mud outside Callum Briggs's lot and looked at a broken loom that 3 men had walked away from. She thought about the specific quality of that looking, the way she had seen not what the loom was, but what it could be made to do. that had been the beginning of everything. Not the $7, not the repair work, not the notebook, though all of those had mattered. The beginning was the way she had looked at a thing everyone else had decided was finished and asked a different question. The question was never whether it could be fixed. It was whether she was the person who was going to fix it. She had been that person. She intended to remain it. The loom was running. The county was changing. The notebook was full, and she had started a second one, and the second one was filling too. There was more to do. There was always more to do. But she was not surviving anymore. She was building something, the way you build things that last. One careful, documented, unhurried decision at a time.